Hello everyone, I'm Elfels, and welcome to another match analysis for the Newport Noctowls. Last time, we kicked off Whooper Club League Season 12 by facing off against Samantha and her Whooper Troopers, where we grabbed a 3-0 win to start the season with a winning record. This time we're up against Greg and his Quiet Majesty, and he actually also started with a winning record, getting a 2-0 victory against the Wobbuffets, showing that he came to the main league to play. We'll discuss the team and plan for the matchup in a second, but first I do want to talk about one transaction I've made going into this week. Klefki is out. This is a pretty early point in the season to trade something away, but I was looking ahead in the matchups and I just didn't see a place for Klefki on my team, especially when Fortress outclasses it for that bulky steel type role. Prankster support also just doesn't really line up with what I like to do in my battles. I would usually just prefer to have straightforward answers to things, so no Klefki. In return for it, I was initially looking into Houndstone, actually. There were some benefits there despite Last Respects not being allowed, of course. It's still a ghost type, and spin blocking actually looks to be pretty useful for me. It also has Fluffy for added bulk as one of its abilities, as well as Sandrush as the other ability, and that's probably the best type synergy we've ever seen on a Sandrush sweeper with Tyranitar. But as far as Fluffy goes, my team isn't really looking for another bulky physical wall, and as far as Sandrush sweeping goes, man, Houndstone's move pool really sucks without Last Respects. You have Shadow Sneak as the best stab move, Body Press, and I guess Crunch and Play Rough. You would need to terrestrialize this for halfway decent Ghost Stab or any other coverage options, and even then its attack stat is just okay and it doesn't even have any setup. I probably would have picked this up if it had something like Poltergeist for good damage or any kind of setup move besides Howl, but I guess it just wasn't meant to be. Maybe another time after some DLC moves come in to help it out. So Houndstone really didn't feel quite worth a trade, but I pivoted over to another ghost type that actually has some sweeping and utility roles that could work with the team. Poltergeist is most well known as a Shell Smash sweeper, and it's better at that than ever nowadays thanks to terrestrialization. Its natural coverage consists of pretty much Shadow Ball, Psychic moves, and Giga Drain, so it couldn't really touch Dark types too well, but now we can get whatever stab coverage we want. Grass is an option for stronger Giga Drains, or Ghost for super powered Shadow Balls, but more likely I'll want to go Fighting or Fairy with Terror Blast to hit those Dark types super effectively. This also doesn't just apply to sweeping or anything. Poltergeist Space 134 special attack is huge. It means that it's a threat even unboosted or just with choice specs. And then we get into the support move pool it has, which is surprisingly deep. Will-O-Wisp can spread burns as well as boosting the power of Hex. Dual Screens, Strength Stat, Trick, Baton Pass as a potential pivot, and then even Memento as a sacrifice option to set up another team member. And on top of that, this trade doesn't even really mess with my speed tiers. Now, Poltergeist is a little slower than Klefki, but it still fills that gap between Tyranitar and Rotom decently well, especially as something that's a lot more likely to invest in speed than Klefki ever was. So it's still a decent support option with the utility I need, while also filling in the role of an offensive sweeping threat that also just always needs to be accounted for in team building. Here's hoping Poltergeist does well this season. Maybe it'll do what Season 11 Blastoise didn't do for me and will actually click Shell Smash once. But anyway, back to the matchup. My opponent's team consists of Meowscarada as the fastest, followed up by Lycanroc Dusk, Palmut, Espathra, Mismagius, Garchomp, Chi-Yu, a big old speed drop down to Titan, Sarina, Sylveon, and then Toxapex. This is an offensive powerhouse of a team, with heavy hitters like Chi-Yu and Garchomp, as well as fast sweeping threats such as Meowscarada and Espathra, supported by Wish Passing of Sylveon, Revival Blessing Palmut, and a Toxapex that absolutely sat on his opponent's team week 1. It's a very demanding team to build against. Outside of that though, the speed tiers jump out as kind of weird. That big gap down from 100 to 73 creates some big opportunities for some of my team, and I think my matchup here is actually pretty decent overall. With that said, I'll get right into the individual threats. Titan feels like something I don't need to prep much for. It's quite bulky and has some pretty hard-hitting moves, but it's walled by some key players that I'm already planning to bring, so no worries here. I will note real quick that after my experience in week 1, writing off Iron Thorns and then seeing it come so effectively with its Terra type, it does feel like a lot of things can come if they just Terra into the right type, so I'll keep that in mind when I'm building teams, but Titan really isn't the most concerning thing in the world still. That's actually the only Pokemon I'm going to completely write off. It feels like there's a niche for everything else. That starts with Sarina, which does overlap quite a bit with the better and faster Grass type on Greg's team, but Grass is a decent matchup enemy at least, and this is also his only source of hazard removal, so realistically there has to be some use there. Majesty was also something I wasn't too concerned about, but it is a spin blocker that's immune to both of Great Tusk's stabs, and it also outspeeds Great Tusk, so it's a surprisingly decent answer to that. Outside of that use though, it doesn't accomplish that much against me, with good but not great stats to work with. Palma is a solid option. It has that Revival Blessing to bring back offensive threats, and its dual stabs are actually kind of threatening. My team isn't the best against fighting types, but it's still kind of a mediocre Pokemon on its own. It just doesn't quite have the stats to keep up in my opinion. And then just missing the cut for me is Lycanroc, which hits really hard and beats both Iron Moth and Hydreigon pretty handily, but it struggles a bit with most of my team thanks to plenty of physical bulk on my side and multiple water types that beat it. Still though, I will need some defensive prep for it. Now, onto the top 6 for me. Espathra is perhaps the biggest setup threat that my opponent could bring, especially with Terra to account for, and I think that if this does come, it's the likely Terra candidate. If it manages to get a few boosts from Calm Mind and Speed Boost, it becomes a problem with stored power real fast, and then it can Terra for stab coverage. I do have multiple psychic resists, so it'll have to choose its Terra type carefully between a few different coverage options, but it could still force a lot of progress against my team. Next up is going to be Sylveon, which I think mostly comes because of its matchup against Hydreigon. I'm actually not bringing Hydreigon this week just because it gets walled so hard by Sylveon unless I'm running some very specific moves to beat it, which I just didn't want to bother with this week. I actually deal with Sylveon decently well outside of that with the rest of my team, but yeah, just for that one matchup, I feel like Greg is pressured into bringing it. Next up is going to be Toxapex, which is another support piece that I think is just too important to leave behind. It's a good regenerator pivot to save health on the rest of his team, and it also walls Azumarill and kind of Iron Moth as well, which I think has to be on his radar. Like Sylveon though, I do have plenty of options to try to deal with it, so hopefully it won't be too hard to handle. Garchomp is a looming presence. It can just be so diverse in what it can do. You'll notice that I haven't been too concerned with the physical attackers too much so far, but Garchomp is a big exception just because it's not just a physical attacker, you know? It can be a hazard stacker with both Stealth Rockets and Spikes, a Rocky Helmet, tank, or a mixed attacker to take advantage of my physical walls, and all those options are just so viable and threatening. Luckily for me, it's not allowed to Terra, so that helps a lot, but it's going to be a problem to deal with no matter which set it chooses. Next up is Chi-Yu, which I was actually looking to grab for myself in round 1 of the draft, but wouldn't you know it, Greg had the pick right before me, and he's already shown just how threatening this thing can be. I think my matchup against it is actually pretty good, with 3 Pokemon on my roster that resist its dual stabs, so I think it might have to avoid its choice spec set, and maybe go with moves like Will-O-Wisp and Ruination alongside its stabs, to get good damage into its checks. So I'll be building around those moves, but regardless, it can still get a lot of damage off. And lastly, Meowscarada is probably the most threatening part of this team. It outspeeds everything that I want to bring, and hits way too hard with Flower Trick and Knockoff, plus its protein boosted coverage of choice. That means that my safe switch-ins to this are basically limited down to Fortress and maybe Rotom, and that's about it. This thing is just going to be so hard to deal with. I don't think I can rely on Fortress to just switch on it every time and get chipped down by that Knockoff taking off his leftovers, all that. So I do have a feeling something on my team is just going to have to sit in on it and take a big hit to hopefully KO in return. That's a lot of demanding threats on my opponent's side, but I also need an offensive core that's able to break through that Toxapex and Sylveon. So I'm trying to find a balance between bulky offense and defense here. We'll start on defense with Tyranitar, which is pretty spadef this week to take as many special hits as we need to. This is my main switch into Chi-Yu. We have enough defensive investment to avoid the 3-hit KO from any Specs attack, and enough attack so that a 2-hit Rock Blast should always KO back after Stealth Rock. We have Rest with a Chesto Berry because I'm expecting to get burned by a Will-O-Wisp, so this is an instant recovery to both get rid of the status and heal up to full after switching into Chi-Yu a couple times. The idea here is to only bring in T-Tar when Chi-Yu comes in, take a hit, set rocks, and otherwise get out of there when it switches out. Outside of that, we're ideally playing a 5-on-5 game with my opponent's Chi-Yu out of the picture because Tyranitar will just come in every time for it. If I ever feel that T-Tar is no longer needed to check the Chi-Yu, it can also have a lot of backup utility in checking things like the Majesty or the Espathra, and that's why we actually have Rock Blast, which should help beat Substitute on that Espathra. We're also running Earthquake as a way to damage Toxapex since I want multiple decent ways to hit that thing. I'm not planning on using Terra for this Pokemon, but I am running Ghost just as a way to get a one-time mix-up against fighting moves and squeeze an extra turn out. Shouldn't come up, but there it is. Next up is Specially Defensive Fortress, which is checking a few different specific threats. The special defense is for Espathra, which shouldn't be able to do too much to us unless it goes for a Terra Fire, in which case I have a Rock Blast Tyranitar waiting to revenge KO it. From there, Gyro Ball hits Espathra harder every turn with the speed boosts, so that should become a winning matchup for us. The other major thing that I'm trying to check is Meowscarada. This is my only Pokemon that I'm bringing that can really consistently take a hit from it. The EV investment was max special defense at one point, but then I started putting EVs into the defense to avoid the 2-hit KO from Banded Knockoff, and then I realized I could just achieve the same thing and even more defense without losing any more special defense by just throwing on a defense boosting nature instead. Yeah, PSA if you didn't know, but unless you need to go max on a lower stat, putting your boosting nature on your highest stat tends to make for a more stat-efficient build. That's not exactly a new revelation or anything, I know. Just something I've been trying to take a little more advantage of lately. But we do check those 2 offensive threats, like I said, and this is actually also probably my best switch into Toxapex. Last week, that Pex actually had a lot of good damage output onto more offensive threats, but Fortress shouldn't care about anything it wants to do. It's even immune to the Toxic that it might throw off, and then we can get a slow Volt Switch out of it to something that actually threatens the Toxapex back. We're almost done with our defensive core, but not quite, because we have Dondozo making its debut with a defensive unaware set meant to check Lycanroc and Swords Dance Garchomp, and to a lesser extent Titan. It's honestly not checking too much that I'm expecting Greg to actually bring, but I did want Dondozo for the security. Without it, those threats are pretty tough for my team to handle. We're running Liquidation for general coverage, as well as Avalanche to hit Garchomp and also Meowscarada. I really wanted something that could hit it super effectively when it's in that pure grass form from Protein, because we could take a Flower Trick decently well and then maybe KO in return. The other 2 slots are for Rest Talk. We can sit on a couple of different things and just continuously heal up, get in a bunch of chip damage with Helmet, and pivot out to whatever we need. Even if Dondozo takes a bunch of damage from something and has to switch out, we can always come in on the Toxapex and rest up on that pretty freely. For the EV investment, we do have enough in special defense to take 2 Draco Meteors from 4 special attack Garchomp, and then the rest is in physical bulk to make this into the best wall it can be. The Terra type on this is Dark. It's nice to get out of the grass weakness in this matchup, but I'm really only going to use this option if the Espathra gets out of hand, because turning into an unaware Dark type can buy me a few extra turns against it. With 3 defensive slots out of the way, we're open for Great Tusk to go in with a very offensive build this week, with an adamant nature thanks to that giant speed gap we can take advantage of. I'm going to use this as my check to hazard setting Garchomp, which is the build I'm expecting this week. We have Protective Pads to block that rough skin damage, and Rapid Spin to clear out the Garchomp's hazards. And then we have Ice Spinner to hit the Garchomp as well as those grass types, Heavy Slam for Sylveon as well as a one-shot on Mismagius, and then Headlong Rush should cover everything else. If this gets a speed boost from Rapid Spin, it can also just go on a tear for a little while with just the 3 move slot coverage and enough speed to outrun Meowscarada when we're at +1. The only thing that really takes multiple hits from Great Tusk is that Titan, since we don't have fighting coverage, but I'm not expecting to see that, and we do have other answers for it. This doesn't just have to be an offensive piece either. With his typing and natural bulk, we can check Palma and Lycanroc in a pinch. This is Terra Steel to get stab heavy slams, and shed a lot of Great Tusk's usual weaknesses like grass and fairy moves that should be coming its way, but this isn't really a primary Terra option. Moving on, fresh off the trade, we have Poltegeist ready for a Shell Smash sweep. This isn't necessarily a win con. I feel like there could be enough priority on my opponent's team to stop a full sweep, but this set could at least open up a few holes in the team before going down. We can set up a few things for us. Toxapex comes to mind as something we can set up on first, as long as it doesn't haze on the same turn, but defensive Sylveon could also work, or Mismagius or Meowscarada if we get into a good Terra type mix-up. From there, we have enough speed to beat the Scarf-based 105s, and Shadow Ball and Stored Power should hit everything for good damage except the Dark types, which is why we have Terra Fighting and Terra Blast. This is my main Terra option if I think I can get a sweep going, since I get that coverage, as well as switching over to the Fighting type, which gives Poltegeist a resist to a lot of my opponent's priority, so Meowscarada Sucker Punch and Lycanroc Accelerock should not be KOing. That's it. It's pretty simple stuff. This is basically the standard Smogon set, but I do see a lot of potential for it here. And now, with a slightly less standard set, we have one last debut with Iron Moth. This started out as a standard attacking set with general coverage, along with speed for Adamant Meowscarada, and then I realized I had a free move slot since fire coverage really doesn't do all that much for me here. So I actually went with Acid Spray as the last slot, which allows Iron Moth to beat his switch-ins by going for the Acid Spray drop on the switch and then KOing on the next turn. I think the most obvious switch-ins to this would be Toxapex and Garchomp, which should be KO'd after an Acid Spray by Psychic and Dazzling Gleam respectively, helped out by that Expert Belt. No Boots this week because I'm pretty confident in my hazard clearing. We're Terra Fairy to get a better neutral matchup into Garchomp, as well as shedding weaknesses in a pinch. This set does feel very reliant on reads to nail that Acid Spray at the right times, but it could be a very high reward breaker for me. With all that said, I'm feeling pretty good about the team. I do wish I could have fit a Azumarill in here somewhere as another Chi-Yu answer, but that'll have to be fine. Let's get right into the battle. Palma and Sarina are here, which means no Toxapex and no Espathra. I'm very happy to see Espathra won't be sweeping today, but no Toxapex means a lot of my prep for it was kind of wasted, and Polteageist doesn't really have nearly the same set of opportunities that I thought it would. Sarina also means hazard removal, which is annoying, but I guess I'll take it. For the lead, I decided in prep that Fortress was probably my best choice, since it matches well into the likely Masquerada lead, and it could also get up some early spikes. So, good luck to Greg, and we're going to start. It's going to be the Garchomp lead. Well, this thing can run fire coverage, and since there's a Fortress on my team, I'm willing to bet it has something for me, so let's just scout out for that now with a switch to Dondozo. And yes, there is a Fire Blast, getting that cute little crit. The calcs on that show that this should be a minus special attack nature, which is good to know. But for the time being, I have a chance to get big damage on this if it decides to get up hazards. So Avalanche away, but that's just going to go into the Sarina switch in for about 19%. Now that actually took the hit really well, and I don't want to take big damage on Dondozo right now, so I'll just go ahead with the obvious switch into Fortress. But a U-turn is just the right play and gets Greg right back into the Chi-Yu to start. Well, time for another obvious switch for me. I'll just go into Tyranitar, and we're going to take the Dark Pulse, which does a whopping 20%. That's a lot more than I was expecting. And yeah, it turns out that this is Choice Specs. Didn't think he'd bring that against my team. But if it is Specs, there's no way it's staying in here, and it's also not Boots. So I'm just going to go for my Rocks to get up more damage on it later. Those are going to go up on the switch to Garchomp, and having this Rocks up is going to be so important for later. Tyranitar can only switch in on Chi-Yu a limited number of times before using up that Chesto Rest strat, so limiting the Chi-Yu switch-ins will help balance that out. But T-Tar's got nothing for the Garchomp here, so it's just going to be a switch to something else now. I think the most likely options here for the Garchomp would be for getting hazards up or going for the Earthquake, so Great Tusk feels like a fine answer to either option. We are just going to switch in on the Earthquake, only take 30% for our troubles. Well, looking around, Ice Spinner looks super free here, so that's just going to come out onto a switch in for Garchomp to Sarina, and it's actually going to do more than half of its remaining health. That chip from Dondozo earlier was actually super helpful. Now, I hesitated for a second here because the Sarina could outspeed me, but a couple of quick calcs show that this Sarina has to be invested in max physical defense from the hits it took earlier. So it cannot be speed invested, and that's going to be an easy outspeed. And we get the first KO to Great Tusk, 6-5. That is going to bring in the Masquerada, the other grass type, for free. So I am going to have to just make another obvious switch back into Fortress. We're going to come in and take the knockoff. That's a bit unfortunate because now we won't have any way to recover health on this anymore. So this Masquerada is going to get threatening pretty soon. But on this turn, I know it's probably U-turn out, and I don't want Garchomp to get in on Fortress for free. I really can't do anything in that matchup. So I think I'm just going to make the double right back into Great Tusk to discourage Garchomp coming in for those hazards. I did get the read right. The Masquerada U-turns out right into the Chi-Yu, takes that lovely Rocks chip. In hindsight, maybe I should have stayed in to do something productive with Fortress on that turn. Maybe set up a layer of spikes or something. But I guess this worked out just fine. I can switch right back into T-Tar to check this. We're going to take some Specs hit. It's a Specs overheat for 32%. And I had to make a decision on whether or not to rest this turn. I know I'm not that low on health yet, but after looking at the calcs, if I come in on a Specs Fire Blast, if that's what he has next time, that does 2-hit KO me from this range, so I do think I have to rest up to full from here. And I'm going to do that pretty safely, just do it as the Garchomp switches in. And we do get the strat off, and we eat that Chesto Berry, get back up to full, but Garchomp is threatening an Earthquake right now. I do have to switch out, but Great Tusk is a little chipped at this point, and I want to use it offensively later, so instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the Dondozo. And we're going to take whatever hit pretty well. Yep, Earthquake only doing 21. From here, I don't think there's any chance he goes for a move or stays in or anything, knowing I can avalanche him back. So I'm gonna go for the liquidation to punish whatever switches in the Garchomp's place. And that actually hits the Palmot to take it just below half. That's really nice, but this is actually kind of a tough spot. The Palmot here is set to do a lot of damage. A Thunder Punch wouldn't kill here, but a Double Shocked would, and either way Dondozo really gets hurt. So my first thought was to switch in Great Tusk or Palmot, or Fortress on the electric move, but a few things stopped me from that knee-jerk reaction. Both of those Pokemon are chipped down already, and they're way too important later to risk switching in now. And this Palmot could also be going for Revival Blessing on the switch to bring that Tsarina, and that Tsarina would be super annoying right now. It could spin away the rocks that I worked so hard to set up, and also force in Fortress for even more chip. That's really bad for the long-term health of my team. So if I think Revival Blessing is the most threatening play right now, I might as well make the play that punishes that, and go for the KO on Palmot. So even if that means I'm potentially sacking Dondozo, I'm clicking Liquidation. It's not the Revival Blessing that comes out, but actually Close Combat that does way too much damage before I take out the Palmot in return. Yeah, that was choice banned damage, and banded Close Combat would have been a hard punish on a Great Tusk or Fortress switch in. Glad I made the play that I did in that case. So that ended up being an over-prediction for my opponent, but I do think it was actually a good play on his part. He didn't really have any reason to think I was going to sack this, so that was a fair play. But in on the revenge is going to be the Meowscarada, and this is probably where I have to let go of the Dondozo. My defensive core is really starting to get chipped down, especially that Fortress that can't take too many more hits, and giving up a sack here might give me an offensive opportunity. Plus, Dondozo's only use right now is as a sack. I don't think it can rest up on anything at this point. There's no Toxapex, and we do have other checks to everything, I think. So I'll just click rest in case I somehow don't go down here, but of course U-turn. We'll just give Meowscarada the KO. And it's going to bring Garchomp in on the blind, which is interesting. Here's a question. If I bring in Great Tusk and set up a Rapid Spin now, is that the game? Garchomp only does 30% with Earthquake, which we have around 60% right now, maybe a little less. And we should KO back with Ice Spinner, and then Chi-Yu and Meowscarada have both revealed that they are not Choice Scarf. It's a Boots Meowscarada and a Specs Chi-Yu. Kinda looks like an easy sweep. Let's try it. First, of course, is to bring in the Great Tusk, grab the speed boost. We actually already outspeed Garchomp, and we only take 31% from this Earthquake in return. Then we just go for the Ice Spinner. Do we KO? Yes, we do. That is Garchomp down. And I think we actually would have gone down to 2 rounds of Rough Skin as well, so I'm glad I have those protective pads on me. So next up is going to be Meowscarada for the revenge, and Sucker Punch should be its only priority option. That shouldn't even 2-hit KO me from this range. So we're just going to Ice Spinner away, and we're just going to go ahead and outspeed and one-shot. Up next is Sylveon, which should take a hit, unless it's Terra Steel Heavy Slam for the one-shot. Not the Terra I was expecting to use, but that's cool with me. And then it's just going to be one last KO with a Headlong Rush on the Chi-Yu to take the game 5-0, with Great Tusk claiming 5 KOs. Good game to Greg. I think he actually played pretty well. He was starting to really make progress on my defensive core. A couple more turns and I would have been in some danger. But it only took one sack for my sweeper to really get in there and find the right opportunity. Greg mentioned after the battle that he wasn't expecting to see such a fast and offensive take on Great Tusk. And yeah, that was probably my favorite part of the build this week. When you have 3 other Pokemon holding down defense, you can really get some cool offensive sets with this thing. I mean, I didn't even expect Great Tusk to go in as much as it did, but hey, it's just that good a Pokemon, I think. Overall, this felt like a good standard balanced team to me. The defensive core that I had wasn't unbreakable or anything, but it bought me enough time and chip damage to really let that sweeper go wild at the end. It's too bad we didn't get to see Iron Moth or Poltegeist come out, but you know, so it goes. So that's a pretty clean game. I'll call it a wrap for week 2. Week 3 has me up against John and the Close Combat Club, another undefeated team. He's 1-0 after his bye week. So see you guys next time for that.